Young men in sidelocks, skullcaps, and sashes sat down at the table to begin studying the Talmud. They bobbed their heads, gesticulated, grimaced. For a long while the congregation was silent. They were reciting the 18 benedictions. Soon the cantor began to intone the high 18 benedictions. Every one of his words sounded to Yasha strangely alien, yet strangely familiar. Blessed art thou, O Lord our God and God of our fathers, God of Abraham, God of Jacob, and God of Isaac, who bestowest loving kindness and possessest all things. Thou sustainest the living with loving kindness, quickenest the dead with great mercy, supportest the falling, healest the sick, loosest the bound, and keepest thy faith to them that sleep in the dust. Yasha translated the Hebrew words and considered each one. Is it truly so, he questioned himself? Is God really that good? He was too weak to answer himself. For a while he heard the cantor no longer. He was half dozing, although his eyes remained open. Presently he roused himself, hearing the cantor say, And to Jerusalem, thy city, return in mercy, and dwell therein as thou hast spoken. Well, they've been saying this for 2,000 years already, Yasha thought, but Jerusalem is still a wilderness. They'll undoubtedly keep on saying it for another 2,000 years, nay, 10,000. The red-bearded beadle approached. If you would like to pray, I'll fetch you a prayer shawl and phylacteries. It will cost you 1 kopeck. Yasha wanted to refuse, but he immediately thrust his hand into his pocket and took out a coin. The beadle offered change, but Yasha said, Keep it. Thank you. Yasha felt an urge to run. He had not worn phylacteries in God knows how many years. He had never put on a prayer shawl, but before he even made the attempt to rise, the beadle was back with the prayer shawl and phylacteries. He opened a prayer book as well. Do you have to say Kaddish? Kaddish? No. He did not have the strength to rise. It was as if he had been shorn of all his powers. He was also afraid. Perhaps the police were waiting for him outside. The prayer shawl bag lay next to him on the bench. Deliberately, Yasha took out the prayer shawl. He fingered the phylacteries within. It seemed to him that everyone was looking at him and waiting to see what he would do. In his stupor, it appeared to him that everything depended on what he would now do with the prayer shawl and phylacteries. If he did not handle them properly, it would be proof that he was hiding from the police. He began to put on the prayer shawl. He looked for the spot where the embroidery was supposed to be, or a stripe which indicated the section meant to be worn over the head, but he could find neither embroidery nor stripe. He fumbled with the ritual fringes. One fringe even lashed him across the eye. He was filled with an adolescent shame and fear. They were laughing at him. The entire assemblage was giggling behind his back. He put on the prayer shawl as best he could, but it slid off his shoulders. He took out the phylacteries and could not determine which one was for the head and which for the arm. And which should one put on first? He sought clarification in the prayer book, but the print blurred before his eyes. Fiery sparks began to sway before him. I just hope I don't faint, he cautioned himself. He felt nausea. He began to plead with God. Father in heaven, take pity on me. Everything else, but not this. He shook off the faintness. Taking out a handkerchief, he spat into it. The sparks continued to dip before his eyes, rising and falling in seesaw motion. Some were red, some green, some blue. There was a clanging in his ears as if bells were ringing. An old man walked over to him and said, Here, let me help you. Remove the sleeve. From the left arm, not the right. Which is my left hand? Yasha asked himself. He began to pull the sleeve from his left arm, and the prayer shawl again fell from his shoulders. A group gathered around him. If Amelia were here to witness this, he thought suddenly, he was now not Yasha the magician, but some fumbling lout whom others assist and make the butt of their scorn. Well, it's come. God's punishment, he said to himself in his anxiety. He was overcome with regret and humility. Only now did he realize what he had attempted and how heaven had thwarted him. It came over him like a revelation. He permitted the men to do with him as they pleased, as one who's suffered a fracture and lets others bandage it for him. The old man wound the thongs around Yasha's arm. He recited the blessing, and Yasha repeated it after him like a little boy. Telling Yasha to lower his head, he fixed upon it the proper phylactery. He wound the thongs around Yasha's fingers in such fashion as to form the Hebrew letters Shaddai. "It must be a long time since you've prayed," a young man observed. "Very long. Well, it is never too late." And the same group of Jews who but a moment before had watched him with a sort of adult derision now looked upon him with curiosity, respect, and affection. Yasha distinctly sensed the love which flowed from their persons to him. "They are Jews, my brethren," he said to himself. "They know that I am a sinner, yet they forgive me." Again he felt shame, not because he had been clumsy, but because he had betrayed this fraternity, befouled it, stood ready to cast it aside. "What's the matter with me? After all, I'm descended from generations of God-fearing Jews. My great-grandfather was a martyr for the holy name." He remembered his father, who, on his deathbed, had summoned Yasha to his side and said, "Promise me that you will remain a Jew." And he had taken Yasha's hand, and held it until he entered his death throes. How could I have forgotten this? How? The circle of Jews had dispersed, and Yasha stood alone in the prayer shawl and phylacteries, prayer book in hand. He felt his left foot draw, tear, but he continued his prayers, translating the Hebrew words to himself. "Blessed be he who spake and the world existed. Blessed be he who was the maker of the world in the beginning. Blessed be he who speaketh and doeth. Blessed be he who decreeth and performeth. Blessed be he who hath mercy upon the earth, and payeth a good reward to them that fear him." Oddly enough, he now believed these words. God had created the world. He does have compassion for his creatures. He does reward those who fear him. And as Yasha intoned these words, he reflected upon his own lot. For years he had shunned the synagogues. All of a sudden, in the course of days, he had twice strayed into houses of worship, the first time on the road when he had been caught in the storm, and now again for the second time. For years he had picked the most complex locks with ease, and now a simple lock which any common safecracker could have sprung in a minute had stumped him. Hundreds of times he had leaped from great heights without injury, and this time he had damaged his foot jumping from a low balcony. It was obvious that those in heaven did not intend to have him turn to crime, desert Esther, convert. Maybe even his deceased parents had interceded in his behalf. Again, Yasha raised his gaze to the cornice of the Holy Ark. He had broken, or contemplated breaking, each of the 10 Commandments. How near he had come to strangling old Zaruski. He had even lusted for Helena, already woven a net in readiness to ensnare her. He had plumbed the very depths of iniquity. How had this come about, and when? He was by nature good-hearted. In the winter he scattered crumbs outside to feed the birds. He seldom passed a beggar without offering alms. He bore eternal hate against swindlers, bankrupts, charlatans. He had always prided himself on being honest and ethical. He stood there with bent knees and was aghast at the extent of his degradations, and what was perhaps worse, his lack of insight. He had fretted and worried and ignored the very essence of the problem. He had reduced others to dirt and did not see, pretended not to see, how he himself kept sinking deeper in the mud. Only a thread restrained him from the final plunge into the bottomless pit. But the forces which are compassionate towards man had conspired that he now stand in prayer shawl and phylacteries, prayer book in hand, amongst a group of honest Jews. He chanted, "Hear, O Israel," and cupped his eyes with his hand. He recited the 18 benedictions, contemplating every word. The long-forgotten childhood devotion returned now, a faith that demanded no proof, an awe of God, a sense of remorse over one's transgressions. What had he learned from the worldly books? That the world had created itself, that the sun, the moon, the earth, the animals, man, had come out of mist. But where had the mist come from? And how could a mist create a man with lungs, with a heart, a stomach, brain? They ridiculed the faithful who attribute everything to God. Yet they themselves attributed all sorts of wisdom and powers to an unseeing nature which was unaware of its own existence. From the phylacteries, Yasha sensed a radiance that reached into his brain, unlocked compartments there, illuminated the dark places, unraveled the knots. All the prayers said the same. There was a God who sees, who hears, who takes pity on man, who contains his wrath, who forgives sin, who wants men to repent, who punishes evil deeds, who rewards good deeds in this world and, what was even more, in the other. Yes, that there were other worlds, Yasha had always felt. He could almost see them. I must be a Jew, he said to himself, a Jew like all the others. Chapter 7. When Yasha went outside again, Gnoya Street was filled with sunlight, with dray wagons, horses, out-of-town merchants and factors, vendors of both sexes, hawking all sorts of wares. "Smoked herring," they cried, "fresh bagels, hot eggs, chickpeas with sugar beans, potato patties." Through the gates rolled wagons stocked with lumber, flour, crates, barrels, goods covered by mats, sheets, and sacks. The shops dealt in oil, vinegar, green soap, axle grease. Yasha stood at the synagogue gate and looked ahead of him. The very Jews who a moment previously had worshipped with such fervor and had chanted, "Let the great name be blessed forever, Amen," had dispersed, each to his own store, factory, or workshop. Some were employers, some employees, some masters, some handymen. It now seemed to Yasha that the street and the synagogue denied each other. If one were true, then the other was certainly false. He understood that this was the voice of evil having its say. But the piety which had consumed him as he stood in the prayer shawl and phylacteries in the prayer house began to cool now and evaporate. He had decided to fast this day as if it were the Day of Atonement. But the hunger which gnawed at him had to be appeased. His foot ached, his temples throbbed. His earlier complaints about religion reasserted themselves. Why all the excitement? Something within him demanded. What proof is there that a God exists who hears your prayers? There are innumerable religions in the world, and each contradicts the other. It's true you weren't able to open Zaruski's safe, and you hurt your foot into the bargain, but what does that prove? That you're unnerved, exhausted, light-headed. Yasha remembered that while praying he had made all sorts of resolutions, and had sworn the most exacting vows, but in the few minutes he had been standing here, all their substance had vanished. Could he really live the way his father had? Could he actually forsake his magic, romantic attachments, his newspapers and books, his fashionable clothes? The vows he had made in the study house now sounded excessive, like the phrases one whispers to a woman in the throes of passion. He raised his eyes toward the pallid sky. "If you want me to serve you, O God, reveal yourself. Perform a miracle. Let your voice be heard. Give me some sign," he said under his breath. Just then Yasha saw a cripple approaching. He was a small man, and his head, cocked to one side, appeared to be trying to tear itself loose from his neck. So also with his gnarled hands. They seemed about to crack from his wrists, even while he was collecting alms. Apparently his legs had only one goal, to grow more twisted. His beard had the same contorted look, and was in the act of tearing itself from his chin. Each finger was bent in a different direction, plucking, it seemed, an unseen fruit from an unseen tree. He moved in an unearthly jig, one foot in front of him, the other scraping and shuffling behind. A twisted tongue trailed from his twisted mouth, issuing between twisted teeth. Yasha took out a silver coin and sought to place it in the beggar's hand, but found himself hampered by the odd contortions of the man. Another magician, he thought, and felt a revulsion, an urge to flee. He wished to throw the coin to the other as quickly as possible, but the cripple apparently had his own game. Pushing closer, he sought to touch Yasha, like a leper determined to infect someone with his leprosy. Fiery sparks again flashed before Yasha's eyes, as if they were constantly present and only needed the opportunity to reveal themselves. He cast the coin at the beggar's feet. He wanted to run, but his own feet began to tremble and twitch as if imitating the cripple's. He spied a soup kitchen and walked inside. The floor was sprinkled with sawdust. Although it was still early, the patrons were already dining. Chicken soup with noodles, fritters, stuffed durma, sweetbreads, carrot stew. The odor of food made Yasha nauseous. "I mustn't eat this kind of food so early in the morning," he admonished himself. He looked back as if about to walk out, but a stout woman blocked his path. "Don't run away, young man. No one is going to bite you here. Our meat is freshly killed and strictly kosher." What connection can there be between God and killing, Yasha wondered. The woman pulled up a chair, and he sat down at a long table, which he shared with the other diners. "A glass of vodka with an egg cookie," she suggested, "or chopped liver with white bread, chicken soup with buckwheat. Bring me whatever you please. Oh, you can be sure I won't poison you." She fetched a bottle of vodka, a tumbler, a basket of egg cookies. Yasha picked up the bottle, but his hand was trembling, and he spilled some of the vodka on the tablecloth. Some of his fellow patrons began to shout, half in warning, half in jest. They were provincial Jews wearing patched gabardines and unbuttoned undergarments faded from the sun. One had a burst of black whiskers extending up to his eyes. Another's beard was red, like a rooster's wattles. A little further down the table sat a Jew wearing a fringed garment and a skull cap. He reminded Yasha of the teacher who had first taught him the Pentateuch. Maybe it is actually he, Yasha thought. No, he would most certainly be dead by now. Perhaps it is his son. Earlier he had felt happy being in the company of devout Jews, but now he was ill at ease, sitting among them. Does one say a benediction over the vodka, he wondered? He moved his lips. When he took a sip from the tumbler, the bitterness cut into him. Darkness swam before his eyes. His throat burned. He reached for an egg cookie, but wasn't able to break off a piece. What's the matter with me? Am I sick? What is it? He felt hostile and ashamed. When the proprietress brought him liver with the white bread, he knew that he should make his ablutions. But there were no facilities for washing here. He bit off a piece of the bread, and the man in the fringed garment asked, "How about making your ablutions?" "He has already," the fellow with the black beard answered sarcastically. Yasha sat silent, amazed at how his earlier affection had been transformed into vexation, pride, and a desire to be alone. He looked away from the others, and they soon began talking about their own affairs. They discussed everything at once: commerce, Hasidism, saintly miracles. So many miracles, yet so much poverty, sickness, epidemics, Yasha reflected. He ate the chicken soup with groats and chased away the flies. His foot continued to ache. He felt his stomach growing bloated. What should I do now, he asked himself. See a doctor? And how could a doctor help? They have only one remedy: put on a cast. Iodine I can smear on myself. But what if it doesn't get better? You can hardly turn somersaults on the tightrope with such a foot. The more Yasha considered his situation, the graver it appeared. He was nearly penniless. Injured, how could he earn his living? What could he tell Amelia? She must be frantic at his not showing up the day before. And what explanation would he make to Magda when he returned home? Where could he say he had spent the night? What was a man worth if his entire existence depended upon a foot, even his love? Now was the time to kill himself. He paid his bill and left. Again he saw the cripple. The man was still spinning and twisting as if seeking to bore his head into an invisible wall. Doesn't he ever grow tired? Yasha thought. How can a merciful God permit a human being to suffer such torment? A wish to see Amelia rose in Yasha. He longed for her company, needed to talk to her. But he could not go to her as he was, dirty and unshaven, the cuffs of his trousers spotted with manure. He hailed a droshky and asked to be driven to Freta Street. He rested his head against the wall of the cab and tried to doze off. Let me imagine myself dead and riding to my own funeral, he thought. Through his shut eyelids he could see the daylight, pink here, cool and shaded there. He listened to the sounds coming from the streets and inhaled the acrid odors. He had to hold on with both hands to keep from falling. "No, I must change. This is no life," he said to himself. "I don't have a moment's peace of mind anymore. I must give up magic and women. One God, one wife like everyone else." From time to time, he opened his eyes slightly to see where he was. They were passing the square on which the bank stood, and the building which the day before had appeared so still and foreboding was crowded with soldiers and civilians. A wagon-load of money rolled in, escorted by armed guards sitting on the outside. When Yasha again peered through his lids, he saw the new synagogue on Tlamatska Street, where the Reformed Jews worshipped, and the rabbis preached in Polish instead of Yiddish. They are religious too, Yasha reflected, but they wouldn't allow paupers to worship in there. The next time he looked, he saw the old Polish arsenal the Russians had converted into a prison. Behind its bars sat Yasha's counterparts. He dismounted at Freta Street and climbed the stairs to his house. Now, for the first time, he felt the extent of his injury. He was forced to lean his weight on his uninjured foot and drag the other behind him. Each time that he lifted the foot, he felt a sharp pain somewhere near his heel. He rapped on the door, but Magda did not open it. He knocked louder. Was she as angry as that? Had she killed herself? He pounded with his fist and waited. He did not have his key with him, and he placed his ear to the door. He heard the parrot screaming. Then he remembered the skeleton key. It would still be in his pocket, but he felt a revulsion for this object which had so humiliated him. Nevertheless, he took it out and opened the door. No one was inside. The beds were made, but it was impossible to tell whether they had been slept in the night before. Yasha went into the room where the animals were kept. His appearance excited them. Each seemed to be trying in its own language to say something to him. Every cage had food and water in it, so it was not that they were hungry or thirsty. The windows were open to let in the air and the sun. "Yasha, Yasha, Yasha!" the parrot shrieked, then snapped its crooked beak and looked askance with a sort of vain querulousness. It seemed to Yasha as if the bird were trying to say, "You're only hurting yourself, not me. I can always earn my few grains." The monkey leaped up and down, and the tiny face with the flattened nose and the wrinkled brown eyes was filled with the sorrow and anxiety of the man in the storybook who is a victim of a magic spell which has caused him to grow bestial. It seemed to Yasha that the monkey asked, "Haven't you learned yet that all is vanity?" The crow tried to speak, but only a human-like cawing and a sort of mimicry came from its throat. Yasha fancied that the bird scolded, mocked, moralized. He reminded himself of the mares. They were in a stall in the court. Anthony, the janitor, was tending to them, but Yasha now longed to see them. Kara and Shiva, dust and ashes. He had wronged them too. On a day like this, they should have been grazing in a green pasture, not standing in a hot stall. He went back to the bedroom and lay down on the bed, fully dressed. He intended to remove his shoes and apply cold water to his foot, but he was too weary to do it. He closed his eyes and lay there as if in a trance. Subchapter 2. Only when he awoke did he realize how deeply he had slept. He opened his eyes and did not know who he was, where he was, nor what had happened to him. Someone was pounding on the front door, and although Yasha heard the knocking, it did not occur to him to open the door. His foot hurt him badly, but he could not remember the reason for the pain. Everything within him seemed paralyzed, but he knew that memory would soon return, and he lay there amazed at his rigidity. Again he heard the knocking, and this time he understood that he must open the door. He recalled what had happened. Was this Magda? But she had a key. For a moment he lay there, his limbs numb. Then he summoned up strength enough to rise and walk to the door. He was barely able to move his left foot. Apparently the foot had abscessed, for his shoe felt tight, the foot hot. He opened the door. Volsky stood there in a light-colored suit, white shoes, and a straw hat. He appeared sallow, wrinkled, as if he had not slept. The black Semitic eyes gazed at Yasha with a sort of knowing mockery, as if aware of what Yasha had been up to the night before. Yasha promptly lost his patience. "What's the matter? What are you laughing at?" I'm not laughing. I have a telegram from Yekaterinoslav. And he took a telegram out of his pocket. Yasha noticed that Volsky's fingers were tobacco-stained. He took the telegram and read it. It was an offer from a Yekaterinoslav theater for 12 performances. They guaranteed a respectable fee. The director demanded immediate confirmation. Yasha and Volsky walked into the other room. Yasha sought not to drag his foot. "Where is Magda?" "Out marketing." "How come you're dressed?" "What do you want me to be, naked?" "You don't wear a suit and tie so early in the morning. And who tore your pants?" Yasha seemed to have lost his power of speech. "Where are they ripped?" "Right here. Besides, you're all dirty. Were you in a fight or something?" Yasha had not realized until now that his pants were torn at the knees and stained with lime as well. He hesitated a moment. "I was attacked by hoodlums." "When? Where?" "Last night on Gensha Street." "What were you doing on Gensha Street?" "I went to visit someone." "What hoodlums? How did they tear your pants?" "They were trying to rob me." "What time was that?" 1 in the morning. "You promised me you'd go to bed early. Instead, you stay up to all hours and get into street brawls. Kindly take a couple of steps." Yasha bristled. "You're neither my father nor my guardian." "No, but you do have a name and a reputation to maintain. I've devoted myself to you as though I were your father. The moment you opened the door, I could tell you were limping. Roll up your trouser leg, please, or better still, take off your pants altogether. You'll gain nothing by deceiving me." "Yes, I fought back. You were probably drunk." "Sure, and I also killed a few people." "Ha! Only a week before the opening." "You've finally got a name. If you appear in Yekaterinoslav, all of Russia will be open to you. Instead, you roam around, God knows where, in the middle of the night. Lift your trousers higher. Your underwear, too." Yasha did as he was bid. Beneath his left knee was a bruise, black and blue, with a large area of torn skin. There was blood on his underpants. Volsky looked on with mute reproof. "What did they do to you?" "They kicked me. The pants are stained with lime. And what's that down there, horse manure?" Yasha kept silent. "Why didn't you put something on it, cold water at least?" Yasha did not answer. "Where's Magda? She never goes out at this time." "Pani Volsky, you're not a prosecutor, nor am I as yet in the witness stand. Don't cross-examine me." "No, I'm not your father nor a prosecutor, but I am responsible for you. I don't wish to insult you, but it's me in whom the confidence is placed, not you. When you came to me, you were an ordinary magician who performed in marketplaces for a few groschen. I pulled you out of the gutter. Now that we're on the brink of success, you go ahead and get drunk or the devil knows what. Last week already you should have been rehearsing, but you didn't even show up at the theater. Posters are plastered all over Warsaw announcing that you are beyond any magician that has ever been, but you smash your leg and don't even call a doctor. You haven't taken your clothes off since yesterday. You probably jumped out of some window," Volsky said with a change of tone. A shudder ran down Yasha's back. "Why a window?" "Undoubtedly escaping from some married woman. The husband probably showed up unexpectedly. We know all about those matters. I'm an old hand at that game. Get undressed and go to bed. You're fooling no one but yourself. I'll call a doctor. It's all over the newspapers about you performing a somersault on the tightrope. It's the talk of the town. All of a sudden you do a thing like this. If you should fail now, everything is finished. It'll heal by the time I open. Maybe it will and maybe it won't. Get undressed. Since it was a jump, I'd like to examine the whole leg." "What time is it?" 10 after 11. Yasha wanted to say something else, but at that moment he heard a key turning in the lock of the door. It was Magda. She came in, and Yasha's eyes opened wide. She was wearing her Sunday dress, last year's straw hat with the flowers and cherries, and high-button shoes. She resembled a countrywoman off to the city to go into service. Overnight she had grown thinner, swarthier, older. Sores and lesions covered her face. Seeing Volsky, she was taken by surprise and began to retreat toward the door. Volsky took off his hat. The hair on his scalp lay like a wrinkled wig. He nodded. His black eyes darted from Yasha to Magda with fatherly concern. His lower lip hung loose in bewilderment. Subchapter 3. Pana Magda, Volsky resumed after a moment, in the tone of one who preaches morality but does so reluctantly. We two made an agreement that you would look after him. He is a child. Artists are like little children, and sometimes a lot worse. See what he has done to himself? I beg you, Pani Volsky, say no more, Yasha interrupted. Magda did not answer, but looked silently at Yasha's bare foot and the wound. Where did you go so early in the morning? Yasha asked. He quickly realized that these words gave away the fact that he hadn't spent the night at home, but it was too late to recall them. Magda started. Her green eyes grew light and malevolent as an angry cat's. I'll give you a full account later. What's going on between you two? Volsky asked, like an elderly kinsman. He did not wait for an answer, but continued, Well, I'll have to fetch a doctor. Apply cold compresses. Maybe you have some iodine in the house. If not, I'll bring some from the apothecary. Pani Volsky, I don't want a doctor, Yasha said sternly. Why not? You have 6 days until the opening. People have already bought tickets in advance. Half the theater is sold out. I'll be ready for the opening. That foot won't heal by itself that quickly. Why are you so afraid of a doctor? There's somewhere I have to go today. I'll see the doctor later. Where do you have to go? You can't walk around with a foot like that. He has to run off to one of his whores, Magda hissed. Her mouth trembled. Her eyes looked off somewhere. It was the first time that Magda, the silent, the bashful, had said anything like that, and in front of a stranger. The words came out in rural accents, and although not loud, were shrill as a scream. Volsky grimaced as if he had swallowed something. I have no wish to mix in your affairs, nor even if I wished to, do I have the right. But there is a time for everything. We've waited for years for this day. This is your chance. You'll become famous. Don't, as the saying goes, put aside your gun an hour before victory. I'm throwing away nothing. I beg you, let me get a doctor. No. Well, no is no. I've been an impresario nearly 30 years, and I've seen how artists commit suicide. Scramble up the mountain for years, but just when the summit is in view, fall and smash themselves. Why this should be, I don't know. Perhaps they have a taste for the gutter. What shall I tell Kuzarski? He asked about you. There's a conspiracy against you in the theater. And how shall I answer the director in Yekaterinoslav? I must reply to his telegram. I'll give you an answer tomorrow. When tomorrow? What will you know tomorrow you don't know now? And what's the point in you two wrangling? You've got to work together. You've got to rehearse just like every other year. If anything, this year more. Unless what you want is to please your enemies and fail with a vengeance, everything will be all right. Well, as it is fated, so it will be. When shall I return? Tomorrow. I'll be here tomorrow morning, but do something for your foot. Take a step, let's see. You're limping. You can't fool me. You either sprained or fractured something. Soak it in hot water. If I were in your shoes, I wouldn't wait until tomorrow. The doctor might order you to put the foot in a cast. What will you do then? The rabble will storm the theater. You know what the clientele of a summer theater is. It's not the opera where the manager comes out before the curtain and announces to the honorable guests that the prima donna has a sore throat. Here they immediately start throwing rotten eggs and stones. I've told you everything will be all right. Well, let's hope so. At times I regret not being in the herring business. And Volsky bowed to both Yasha and Magda. He mumbled something in the hall, then he went out, slamming the door. A Christian, and he wails like a Jew, Yasha said to himself. He had an impulse to laugh and looked out of the corners of his eyes at Magda. She had not spent the night at home, he decided. She'd been wandering about, but where had she been? Was she capable of this sort of revenge? Jealousy and disgust mingled in him. He had an impulse to seize her by the hair and drag her along the floor. Where were you? Where, he wanted to say, but he restrained himself. He imagined that each second the rash on her face grew worse. He unclenched his fist, lowered his head, stared down at his naked leg. He looked angrily at Magda. Fetch me cold water from the pump. Get it yourself. And she burst out crying. She fled from the room, slamming the door so violently that the window panes rattled. I guess I'll lie down for another half-hour, Yasha said to himself. He returned to the bedroom and stretched out on the bed. His leg had stiffened, and he could barely extend it. He lay there looking out at the sky through the window. High above him a bird was in flight. It seemed as small as a berry. What would happen to such a creature should it injure its leg or wing? For it, there would be only one way out, death. It was the same with man. Death was the broom which swept away all evil, all madness, all filth. He closed his eyes. His foot throbbed, pinched. He wanted to remove the shoe, but the shoelace had become knotted. The swelling had grown. He felt the flesh on his toes becoming puffy and sponge-like. The foot might well become gangrenous. Perhaps it would have to be amputated. No, rather death. Well, my 7 years of good fortune are over. They are not to be trusted, he exclaimed, not knowing whether he meant women or Gentiles or a combination of both. Undoubtedly, the devil dwells in Amelia also. His mind became vacant, and he lay in that warm fatigue that precedes sleep. He dreamed that it was Passover, after the Seder, and that his father was saying, "Isn't that funny? I've lost a groschen." "Papa, what are you saying? It's Passover." "Oh, the ceremonial wine has made me drunk." The dream lasted only a few seconds. He awoke with a start, and the door opened as Magda came in carrying a basin of water and a napkin to be used as a compress. She glared at him spitefully. "Magda, I love you," he said. "Scum! Whoremaster! Assassin!" She burst into tears again. Subchapter 4. Yasha was well aware that what he contemplated was pure madness, but he had to go and see Amelia. He was like a subject who has been hypnotized and must fulfill his master's commands. Amelia was expecting him, and her expectation drew him like a magnet. Magda had gone off somewhere again. He knew that now was the moment to go. The following day might be too late. He rose, resolving to ignore his foot. He needed a shave, a bath, a change of clothes. "I must talk everything over with her," he said to himself. "I can't leave her hanging in mid-air." When he went to shave, he found his razor had vanished. Magda had a habit of hiding things. Each time she cleaned up, something else was missing. She was capable of concealing a tie in the stove, slippers under a pillow. Always the peasant, Yasha thought. He put on a fresh shirt, but a cufflink fell from the sleeve and disappeared. Apparently it had rolled under the wardrobe, but he was unable to bend. He had other cufflinks somewhere, but where? Magda even tucked money away in odd places, where it would turn up months afterwards. Yasha stretched out on the floor and began to search under the wardrobe with his cane, but this effort produced only stabbing pains in his foot. Then his stomach began to ache also. "The devils are starting already," he muttered to himself. "Now there's nothing but bad luck." Magda had returned and had removed her Sunday dress. He could see she had been shopping, for she held a basket from which protruded the legs of a chicken. "Where are you going?" "I was just about to prepare lunch." "Prepare it for yourself." "Running back to your Piast whore?" "I'll go where I please." "We're finished. I'm going home today, you dirty Jew." She seemed afraid of her own words. Her mouth agape, she stood with her hand raised as if to avert a blow. Yasha blanched. "Well, that's the end." "Yes, the end. You bring out the devil in me." And she threw down her basket and intoned a peasant dirge as if she had been scourged. The chicken lay there, its bloody neck aloft, ringed by onions, beets, potatoes. Magda fled into the kitchen, and then Yasha heard a rattling sound, as if she were vomiting or strangling. He had risen to his feet, still gripping the cane he had used in his search for the cufflink. For some inexplicable reason, he righted the chicken and covered its torn neck with a beet. He continued to search for the cufflink. He wanted to go into the kitchen to see what Magda was up to, but he restrained himself. In a little while, Amelia will undoubtedly call me the same name, he thought. Yes, everything is collapsing like a house of cards. He dressed himself somehow. When he passed the corridor, he heard through the closed door Magda scraping a pot with a whisk. He hobbled down the stairs, feeling pain with each step. He barely managed to reach the barber shop, but there was no one on the premises. He called out, stamped his sound foot, pounded on the wall, but no one came. "They just leave everything and go off," he grumbled to himself. "That's Poland for you." And still they complained that the country is torn to pieces. Probably ran off to play cards, the bum. Well, I'll just have to go to her unshaven. Let her see the state I'm in. He stood waiting for a droshky, but none came. "That's the kind of country this is," he mumbled. "All they can do is rebel every few years and rattle the chains." He managed to get to the Avenue Dluga, found a barber shop, and walked in. The barber was busy cutting a customer's hair. "When a barrel is filled with cabbage, you can't stuff any more in," the barber was saying. "Cabbage isn't like flax. It can't be squeezed together. When the barrel's full, it's full. With dough, dear sir, it's even worse. I'm reminded of something that happened to a woman who wanted to bake a cake for her mother. She kneaded the dough, added the yeast, and all the other things. At the last minute, she decided to bring the dough to her mother's house in Praga and bake it there, because the flue in her stove was blocked, or the stove smoked, or something like that. So she packed the dough in a basket, covered it with a cloth, and took the omnibus. It was warm in the omnibus, and the dough began to rise. It crept out of the basket as if it were alive. She tried to stuff it back, but dough is something that won't be pushed. When she squeezed from one side, it billowed out the other. The cover flew off. The basket swelled, and bang, it burst. Anyway, I think it burst." "Is dough that strong?" the man in the chair asked. "Of course it is." A real commotion started in the omnibus. There were several smart Alecks on board, and she must have put a lot of yeast in that dough. It wasn't so much the yeast as the heat. It was a hot summer day, and why do they go on like that? Besides, he's a liar. The basket would never have burst, Yasha thought. But my shoe will. My foot's abscessing. And why doesn't he acknowledge my presence? Maybe I'm one who sees but isn't seen. "Is there a long wait?" he asked. "Till I'm finished, sir," the barber said, mingling courtesy with derision. "I have just one pair of hands. I just can't cut hair with my feet. And if I could, what would I stand on? My head, perhaps? What do you think, Pani Mieczyslav?" "You're absolutely right," his customer replied. He was a short, big-headed man with a straight nape and blonde, spiky hair, which reminded Yasha of a pig's bristle. The man turned and looked at Yasha with contempt. His eyes were a watery blue, small and deeply set. Evidently the barber and his customer had formed an alliance. Nevertheless, he waited until the barber had finished with his customer and the tips of the man's mustache had been waxed. Suddenly the barber underwent a transformation and began to chat familiarly with Yasha. "Lovely day, isn't it? Summer, real summer. I like the summer. What good is the winter? Frost and catarrh. Sometimes it is too hot in the summer and one sweats, but that's no tragedy. Yesterday I swam in the Vistula, and someone drowned before my very eyes." "In the bathhouse?" "He wanted to show off and swam from the men's to the women's bathhouse. They wouldn't have let him in anyhow because the women bathe naked. So what was the sense of the whole thing? Is it worthwhile to give one's life for a joke? When they pulled him out, he looked asleep. I couldn't believe he was dead. And for what purpose this sacrifice? Just to make an impression. Yes, people are mad." Subchapter 5. "I must decide everything today," Yasha said to himself in the droshky. "Today is my day of reckoning." He closed his eyes to devote himself exclusively to his thoughts, but he passed street after street without reaching a decision. Again, blindly, he heard the sounds of the city, inhaled its smells. Coachmen shouted, whips cracked, children caroused. From courtyards and bazaars, warm breezes blew, rank with manure, fried onions, the sewage, and the odors of the slaughterhouse. Laborers were ripping up the wooden sidewalks, changing round cobblestones to square ones, installing gas street lights, digging ditches for sewers and telephone lines. The bowels of the city were being rearranged.